And who better to embody today's generation of transformative LGBTQ+ leaders than our next speaker. From her teenage years in political activism to making headlines as the first openly trans student president at American University, my alma mater. Any other AU Eagles here? Couple, I see some hands, all right. She has dedicated her life to uplifting community. She led the advocacy effort to protect all people from gender identity and gender expression-based discrimination in her beloved home state of Delaware. As a woman of many firsts, she is also the first openly transgender woman to work in the White House, rising from intern to a staff role, the first openly transgender speaker at a national political convention, and is recognized as the first openly trans state senator in American history. Through these firsts, she has fought for equality for all. Please welcome to the stage my friend, my former colleague, and my inspiration for what is possible, Delaware State Senator Sarah McBride.
Well, thank you so much, Dina, and in the immortal words of the Golden Girls theme song, thank you for being my friend. Good morning, Out and Equal. All right, come on, a little bit more. Good morning, Out and Equal. That's better. It is so, so great to be here today. As I stand on this stage, I'm looking out at so many familiar faces, and I am filled with gratitude. Gratitude to be in a space like this, to be in community with you all, to look out on a room full of LGBTQ people and allies who serve as leaders throughout our economy and throughout our country. And as I join you today, I want to start by saying thank you. For decades, people in this room and those who came before us have been on the front lines of change. You have forged trails that have allowed others to flourish. You've opened hearts and changed minds. You've grown our ranks of allies. You've proven that we can live and lead openly all at the same time. And personally, you've not only made it possible for someone like me to serve in public office, but it's organizations like Out and Equal that have helped solve the crisis of hope that I faced as a young person, when I feared, like many of you, that my dreams and my identity were mutually exclusive, when I worried that the heart of this country was simply not big enough to love someone like me. In that crisis of hope, people in this room provided kernels of hope for me. People like Amanda Simpson, who I remember when I was buried deep in the closet in high school, watching become the first transgender woman to be appointed by the President of the United States to any position in our federal government. And it's because of people like Amanda that I get to stand before you this morning as both an out queer transgender woman and as a state senator serving the state I was born and raised in. Growing up, that sentence would have seemed so impossible to me that it was almost incomprehensible. And that's the beauty of this room. That's the power of this space. We are literally living impossibility. And right now, I don't take that progress for granted. Because at this moment, across our country, anti-equality politicians are attempting to undo our progress. They're trying to rip our hope away from us. They are engaging in a mean and malicious effort to bully some of the most vulnerable but amazing members of our community, transgender young people. They're trying to rip trans kids away from parents and providers, coaches and classmates, teammates and teachers, friends and family members, stripping away any layer of support that these trans kids may have, leaving them isolated, telling these kids that they are unworthy of love and support, that they don't belong in our country. But they do belong. We belong, and we belong everywhere, that presence, the power of our proximity, it is the superpower of our movement. In living our lives openly and authentically, we are organic agents of change. We see how our presence in workplaces improves company policies. We see how a child coming out can transform a family's love. And we see that when we have a seat at the table in government, policies and priorities change. It's easy to score points on the backs of a community when you don't have to look them in the eye, when you don't have to answer their questions, when you don't have to deal with their votes. It's easy to deprioritize our needs when we aren't nearby. At a minimum, our presence makes the job of anti-equality forces that much harder and more uncomfortable. And we serve as an undeniable and unavoidable reminder of the humanity of our community. But even more importantly, through our presence and our perseverance, we maintain the bonds that over time, admittedly all too slowly, can open the most closed of hearts and minds. Last year, I had a deeply moving experience on the floor of the Delaware State Senate. It was the final week of our legislative session. Just 2 days earlier, I had made an electoral announcement that for federal tax purposes, I can't explicitly state right now in this space, but it had to do with finally sending a trans person to that big domed building down the street. And that was an announcement that unsurprisingly got a lot of attention. It was an announcement that was also met with what is all too common when an LGBTQ person strives to do something that has never been done before. I faced hate, vitriol, and the risk of violence. And because of that risk, our state capitol had to increase security, a fact that both my Democratic and Republican colleagues were aware of. And so coincidentally, 2 days after that announcement, with increased security visible, I brought forward legislation that I was sponsoring to ban the LGBTQ panic defense in Delaware, a legal defense that many of you are aware of that essentially claims that anti-LGBTQ violence is excusable. The bill had passed the state house on fairly partisan lines a few weeks before. I presented the bill to the Senate, gave my opening remarks, and prepared to do what all of us in this room have gotten far too used to doing: defend my dignity and our humanity. I finished my remarks, I paused, I waited for my conservative colleagues to stand up and oppose the bill, to say at the very best that this was a solution in search of a problem, or at worst to allude to reasons why violence might be understandable, if not justified. It's what we've heard in other legislative bodies. And so I braced myself as my colleagues stood up to speak. But then something amazing happened. Each one stood up with that increased security visible in that space. They looked me directly in the eyes, and with tears swelling in their eyes, they validated the pain and the fear that many LGBTQ people live with. They affirmed the dignity of LGBTQ lives. And to a person, they not only declared that they would be voting for the bill, but led by the most conservative member of that caucus. For the first time in any legislative body in the United States, every single Republican stood up and asked to be added as co-sponsors to that bill. And look, I know that's a low bar. I know that making clear that there is no excuse for violence is quite literally the bare minimum. But what happened in that moment was more profound than the single policy before us. Because what happened in that moment, due to the swell of circumstances, due to the power of our proximity, was that these politicians began to understand that the political is fundamentally personal. that this wasn't an abstract issue, but something that impacted someone they knew, and yes, someone that they cared about. And while that moment of breakthrough won't change their minds on every issue of LGBTQ equality overnight, while they won't be leading the Pride Parade tomorrow, you can't undo that synaptic connection once it happens. And it's in moments like these, often so small to be almost invisible, that so much of our progress has been built. It's how public opinion has progressed. It's how previously cautious industries have become increasingly unwavering allies. And in this critical hour, the greatest threat to our movement is not that we underestimate the fight ahead of us. The biggest risk in this moment is that we fail to summon the hope necessary to see it through. Right now, it's considered in vogue to be cynical. It's considered naive to be hopeful. And I get it. It can be easy to feel hopeless. Despite how far we've come as a community and as a country, this moment feels different than 10 or 15 years ago, when it felt like if we simply worked for it, change was inevitable. That if we simply volunteered and voted and told our stories, that we could bend the arc of the moral universe inalterably toward justice. It's hard to feel now that if we do what we need to do, everything will work out. And for the first time in a long time, we can't quite see the light at the end of the tunnel. But the truth is, that sense of inevitability that we felt 10 or 15 years ago, that is the exception in our nation's history. Every previous generation of Americans has been called to conquer seemingly insurmountable odds even greater than the ones we face today. Enslaved people in the 1850s who had no reason to believe that an Emancipation Proclamation was on the horizon. Children risking life and limb in factories in the 1890s who had every reason to think that things would never get better. Unemployed workers standing in bread lines during the early days of the Great Depression who had never heard of a New Deal. Civil rights marchers facing brutality as they set off from Selma who didn't know whether their efforts and their bravery would result in the Voting Rights Act. Patrons at the Stonewall Inn who fought back against government oppression and never knew of an America where they could live openly and authentically without violating the law. All of those Americans, every single one of those generations, had every reason to fear that change would never come. They couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but they persevered. They summoned their hope, they found the light, and they changed the world. And if they have done it before, then I know we can do it again. Because so long as we exist, we educate. So long as we are present, we progress. And so long as we breathe, we hope. Which is why standing here today, I am as confident as ever that we have what it takes to ensure that the story of this moment, the story of this time, is not the story of bigotry and backlash, but of pride and of progress. That it will be the story of all of us coming out, conquering our crisis of hope, finding that light, and building a world where LGBTQ young people, including trans kids, can grow up and know that they belong. They belong in our communities, they belong in our schools, they belong in our workplaces, and yes, they even belong in the halls of Congress. Thank you all very much. It's an honor to be with you today, and it's a privilege to be with you in this fight.